Welcome everybody to our first set of video recorded notes about power distribution in government. My name is Mr. Beckman, and if this is your first video watching from me, this is going to kind of walk you through a little bit of a more complicated topic. I wanted to make a video for this because some of these concepts and vocab words can be a little bit tough, so I wanted to go into a little bit more detail with them so that you can use this to review when it's time to take a Constitution test, the unit test, or if you're just having a hard time with this concept in general. Feel free to pause this whenever you need to. If you're in class watching this video, you can always raise your hand and ask me to explain something further for another example, or you can always email me outside of classroom too, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Hopefully you've got your notes packet open and ready to go, and let's get started. Okay. After the Declaration of Independence, the DOI, our founding fathers had a lot of options about what we wanted to do with our new country. There were some things that they knew that they wanted. They knew they wanted rights that couldn't be taken away, called unalienable rights. They knew they wanted the people to be in charge. That's a concept called popular sovereignty. They knew they wanted limitations on the government and for the government not to be able to do whatever it wanted. They wanted separation of powers to make sure that one branch couldn't overpower another branch. They also knew that there were things that they didn't want, like, for example, a king, a really strong leader with too much power. They knew that they did not want a government that didn't listen to its people. I know that's a double negative, but they wanted the government to understand the people's problems. The founding fathers, or the framers as they're sometimes called, tried to look at examples from the past. A lot of them were kind of amateur historians, and they wanted to learn from the mistakes of the past and also try to use good examples from the current world. They looked at Athens and Rome, which had democracies. They looked at England and France that did have monarchies, but some things in the governments worked. And they looked at some of the philosophers that you learned about yesterday: Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. They wanted to create a government that was going to be perfect for them, but they didn't know exactly which government to use. A theocracy is a government led by the religion. A monarchy is a government led by a king. Anarchy is when there's no government at all. A dictatorship is a government led by a strong leader. Then there are two types of democracy that we're going to talk about today. Okay. Now, a little bit more detail. Let's talk about autocracies. In your notes, you're going to be looking for advantages, disadvantages, and then the definitions. Okay. These words here in the underline, or words that are in bold, are going to be your kind of visual clue that that is the important information. Now, as I said, in autocracies where power and authority is completely held by one person. You've probably heard of a totalitarian dictatorship before, even if it wasn't called by that name. North Korea today, which is led by a dictator named Kim Jong-un, is a good example of an autocracy. A monarchy can be absolute, where the king has total power, or queen, or constitutional monarchy is where they don't have as much power. A constitutional monarchy would be like England today, where they still have a queen, but she doesn't do all that much. If you think about an autocracy, it might sound pretty bad at the beginning, especially if you know what is going on in North Korea. But the advantage to an autocracy, the pro of an autocracy, is that decisions can be made pretty quickly. If the enemy is invading you, you are going to need to be able to make decisions quickly. So it's good to have one person in charge instead of hundreds of people in charge, like we have in Congress. The downsides, the disadvantages, the cons of an autocracy is that if one person is calling the shots, then there's no one to kind of stop that one person from doing whatever they want. So it can lead to a lot of disadvantages for minority groups or people who disagree with the leader. An oligarchy is where power and authority to rule is held by a small group of individuals, usually less than a dozen or so. We don't see too many of these in government anymore. There used to be more of these out in the world. For example, the Iroquois Indians were an oligarchy where they would have a small group of people, a council of elders or something like that, make decisions for them, but we don't see it too often in the world anymore. A democracy. Now, this is the one that you've probably heard of before. Democracy comes from two Greek words because that's where it was invented. Demos means the people, and kratia means to rule. So democracy really means rule by the people, but that's a little too simple for what we are going to talk about in this class. Instead, for the definition, you can write down that a democracy is a system of government in which people select policymakers so that those policies reflect the will of the governed. The underlined stuff is the stuff you gotta know. Democracy, we choose people to make decisions. Sometimes we ask everybody in a whole community to make a decision. Other times we elect somebody to make decisions for us. This is a breakdown of how different types of democracies work. A direct democracy is where everybody gets to vote all the time. This is how Athens worked, where all the citizens got to vote on every decision. Athens was a relatively big city-state at the time, but still by today's standards, it was small. Today, just in America alone, there are 340 million people approximately. So if all 340 million of those people had to vote on every single decision, it would take a lot of time to get things done. Instead, we use what's called representative democracy, which was first invented in ancient Rome. This is where we choose people to make decisions for us, and how those people make decisions can also be split into categories called unitary, confederate, and federal, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Okay. Now, the founding fathers just ended up deciding on representative democracy, or sometimes it's called a republic. But there were still a lot of decisions to make. Who is going to get to decide? How are we going to elect people? How are we going to enforce laws? What are we going to do with other countries? So we had more decisions to make. Okay? The basic problem was who is going to rule and how are they going to rule? So even with the representative democracy that they decided on, there were still three subsections that they could use. A unitary government, which is the most popular type of government in the world. A confederate government, which is much less popular and like oligarchies isn't really seen in the world today. And a federal government, which is what we use here in America. A unitary government is a government where all the power is held by a single central agency. That would essentially mean that instead of having a city or state capital, for example, Jefferson City, all of our decisions in America would be made in Washington, D.C., where the central government would have all the power and they would be in charge. Most of the governments, most of the democracies in the world are unitary. So there are lots of examples out there, but Great Britain is a good illustration, a good example of this type. They have one government, for the most part, making the decisions that is based out of London. The nice things about a unitary government is that you have the exact same laws everywhere throughout the country. Okay? You don't have to worry about having to know the different laws of the different states that you're in based on your location. Okay? For example, in Missouri, it is mandatory for motorcycle riders to wear helmets, but in Illinois, it is not. So on nice days during the summer, a lot of motorcycle riders will go to Illinois and take off their helmets. But if they come back into Missouri in the evening time, they will often see police officers sitting on the Missouri side of the bridges coming from Illinois. And then if they're not wearing their helmets, those Missouri police officers can then give tickets to the motorcycle drivers for not wearing their helmets. That is kind of taking advantage of our system. In a unitary government, we wouldn't have to worry about that. There are other examples of how some states allow things that other states do not, that we're going to talk about more as the class goes on. The disadvantage of a unitary government is that they're slow in meeting local problems. It's hard for stuff to get done at a local level. I said that Great Britain is a good example of this. Well, Great Britain is a lot smaller size-wise than America. In an earlier activity, you learned about how I was able to get a traffic light changed. It was always sitting on red, and no matter what I did, it was just going to sit on red for 4 or 5 minutes until I could turn out of a street near my house. Well, I called up the Missouri Department of Transportation, and I told them about this, and it took about 2 weeks, but eventually they sent a crew, And they called me back and told me that the scale that was connected to the traffic light was broken. And they repaired it. And sure enough, now that traffic light lets me go on green instead of sitting for 5 minutes waiting for the light. If I had to write to Washington, D.C. instead of the Missouri Department of Transportation, that problem would have taken a lot longer to get fixed. So that's why a unitary government isn't so great. It's hard for them to meet local problems, solve local problems. A confederate government is our next system, and this will be the next little chart down your paper. A confederate government is an alliance of independent states. This is actually how America got started under the Articles of Confederation. The southern states also broke away from America during the Civil War and formed a confederation too. The world doesn't have too many confederations anymore. It really has kind of gone out of style because it's nice to have all of the states work together all of the time, instead of just deciding if they want to cooperate or deciding if they want to be isolated. The European Union is really the closest thing that we have to a confederation today, and it is kind of going through some struggles right now as Great Britain is getting ready to leave the European Union. The advantages of a confederation is that it keeps the powers at a local level, which means you don't have to worry about a king or a large government entity telling you what to do. It also allows several states to cooperate when they want or retain their separate identities when they want. The states get to decide what rules they want, and the states get to decide how they want to enforce those rules too. The disadvantage is that oftentimes there are problems with duplication of services. That means that states might try to solve the same problem without cooperating with each other, and that can lead to issues. For example, there are lots of diseases that are carried by mosquitoes. For example, the Zika virus is one that you may have heard of before. And it causes a lot of problems with pregnant moms and babies. And one thing that states have done in the past is try to fight this solo to help their states out. If one state like Louisiana tries to fight mosquitoes by developing a vaccine, and another state tries to fight mosquitoes by sucking up lots of water puddles after rainstorms, they're going to spend a lot of money trying to fight mosquitoes, whereas if they would have teamed up in the first place, they might have been able to get the job done with just one of those solutions. So it leads to some duplications of services and lots of extra money being spent when it didn't need to be. Another problem is that citizens living in different parts of the country can be treated differently. Okay, for example, if you are living in the Confederate States of America, then in the 1860s, they had different laws treating people differently. For example, they allowed slavery. So in a confederacy, citizens can be treated differently based off of where they live. And a lot of people have issue with that. Excuse me. There are also fights over who's in charge. Should it be one state, or should we allow one entity to make certain decisions, especially when it comes to international relations? Imagine if Texas wanted to go to war with Mexico, but Arizona did not. Well, that might lead to some problems because, in theory, all states should be on board if we're going to go into a conflict. So it leads to some issues with international relations. Lastly is the federal government. This is a government where the power is divided between the central government and several local governments. This is what we use, where we have power in Washington, D.C., but we also have power in Jefferson City. In the United States, we have 50 state governments, we have hundreds of city and local governments, but then we've also got the national government who is in charge. One of the advantages of this is that we have a lot of federal unity. We can team up as a whole nation on things, but we also let local governments handle local problems, like my traffic issue. Or let's say that Missouri is dealing with a concern that other states don't have to deal with. Say, for example, trying to figure out how to solve the meth crisis that is taking over large portions of Missouri. Other states don't have that issue, so other states maybe shouldn't be able to tell us how to deal with our problems. That's the concept of federal government, that the national government's there to solve the big problems, state governments are there to solve the state problems. The disadvantage of this is, again, duplication of services. The example I used earlier about mosquitoes happened in a federal government because the states didn't cooperate with each other. Oftentimes, we also have citizens living in different parts of the country still being treated differently depending on where you live. So, for example, right now the country is going through a conversation and a conversion about how to legally treat marijuana. And a citizen living in one part of the country can have access to marijuana, where in other parts of the country, citizens do not have access to that drug. And people are treated differently because the states are in charge. We also have a lot of disputes over power, whether a state should be in charge of an issue or the national government should be in charge of an issue. Going back to the concept of marijuana legalization, when the first state, Colorado, did it, President Obama said that he was going to treat it as a state issue. Technically speaking, it is still against federal laws to use or smoke marijuana in any capacity. However, the president decided that he was going to let the states handle it. President Trump has said that he was going to crack down on marijuana use. He used that as one of his campaign promises. He has not done that so far as of August of 2019. However, this could lead to fights in the future over who's in charge of what, and especially where does taxation money go to. The last type of thing to decide is what kind of leadership style are we going to have. Okay, we've talked about checks and balances. We've talked about who's going to be in charge and making sure one leader doesn't have too much power. And there are two ways of going about that. In America, we use the presidential style of government. That means that we have a government where the executive branch is led by a person who is both the head of state and the head of government. Now, that's a little high concept. Essentially what it means is that the president is in charge and he is separate from, or she is separate from, the legislative branch. This is advantageous because there's more of a system of checks and balances. The legislative branch can be told what to do by the president, and that way the legislative branch can't do whatever they want. The disadvantage is that oftentimes we can have gridlock, which means that, for example, if the House of Representatives is controlled by Democrats, but the president is a Republican, then that can lead to different people wanting to do different things and nothing will happen. That's called gridlock. Okay. Again, in America, we use the presidential system. They are independent of the legislative branch. That means that Congress cannot tell them what to do necessarily, can't force the president to do things, and the president can't force Congress to do things in return. It goes both ways. In the parliamentary system of government, the executive branch cannot check the legislative branch. The legislative branch gets to tell the parliamentary leader what they can and cannot do. The prime minister is the person who leads the government. Instead of having a president, for example, in England, they have a prime minister who gets to work with the legislative branch and gets chosen in part by the legislative branch. The advantage to this is that gridlock can be avoided and the executive branch can work with the legislative branch to try to solve problems. The disadvantage to this is that there are no checks and balances. Parliament is the one in charge, and the prime minister just has to basically work to do what the parliament says. This is more characteristic of unitary governments. All right, that takes us to the end of our notes. I know that a lot of this stuff was kind of complex, so if you still have issues, if you still have questions, feel free to ask me, and I'd love to give you more examples or a more concrete answer to any of your questions. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Good luck with the rest of your assignments.